the governments couldn't and shouldn't intervene. Keynes contradicted that and took the view that, yes, government needed to intervene. Milton Friedman said, don't worry about the trade unions, control the money supply, they will just have to do it. They'll be brought into line. She didn't believe that. The velocity was unstable, and therefore we couldn't rely too much on this relationship in the equation. And she said, you're being alarmist, you're being defeatist. I hoped that we could go back to an incomes policy, but I realised that it was unrealistic.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director here, and for the next hour, I'm going to be in conversation with Sir Tim Lankester, the author of Inside Thatcher's Monetarism Experiment, The Promise, the Failure, the Legacy. Tim was Margaret Thatcher's first private secretary for economic affairs. He subsequently held senior positions at the Treasury, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Overseas Development Administration. Tim, thank you so much for joining us tonight. No, I said when we spoke on the phone that to a certain extent you're walking into the lion's den. You knew coming in here that you're coming to an organisation that was historically quite associated with monetarism, although we entertain a variety of different views. So I'm all the more delighted that you've come to talk to us about your book, being aware, I suppose, that I might push back very gently and others in the audience may wish to do so too. Yeah. But I enjoyed the book a great deal, actually. It's given the subject matter, it is extremely readable and extremely accessible, and I think it's a great skill to be able to talk about monetarism, Keynesianism, and some of those quite complex economic events of the 70s and the 80s so lucidly, and I hope that it reaches a wide audience. So, look, I want to start with the all-time classic book club question, which is, why did you write the book? And I suppose particularly, why did you write it now?
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks for inviting me. Well, I've long felt that there's a lack of balance in the public's assessment of Margaret Thatcher's economic record. On the one hand, you have the arch critics who point to the doubling of unemployment, with unemployment staying around 3 million for most of the 80s, the loss of manufacturing capacity, greater inequality, greater insecurity, and that's the negative side. And there are people who take this view. The other side are the congratulators, if you like, who point to the recovery of productivity after the dismal 1970s. From 1983 to the early 90s, productivity rebounded to around 5% per annum. And it didn't continue at quite that rate. But for 20 years, you had productivity on a much better trajectory than we had in the 70s. Just remember, though in the 50s and 60s, productivity was pretty good. It was so-called golden age. We were about 5%. So we were back to that. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, was a tremendous achievement, because without productivity, you can't do anything. I mean, all the things we want to do, as we are told by our current Prime Minister repeatedly, you can't do it without productivity growth. And this was made possible, essentially, by the supply-side reforms, the curbing of the power of the trade unions, the liberalisation of financial services, the ending of our exchange controls, the championing and joining the single market, and the closing of uneconomic nationalised businesses, and the privatisation programme. All that was great. I'm on the side of the congratulators, or the self-congratulators, with one rather notable exception, and that is what I believe was a big mistake, which I was part of, although I was a civil servant, I wasn't a politician. The mistake of adopting a hard monetarist agenda at the start of the administration, and that, I believe, resulted in, well, we can go into it in a moment, but it resulted in an excess of unemployment. Excess in the sense that unemployment went well beyond a level that was necessary to get inflation down. And that was because we were chasing frankly, unrealistic monetary targets, and with the fact that we had extremely tight monetary policy and extremely tight fiscal policy. So, of course, we got inflation down, but the price was high. The price was, in my view, unnecessarily high. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, now, that's very interesting. Now, I'd like to build back up to that and go into some of those things you raise in a bit more detail. Yeah. But I also noticed that we have a relatively young audience in the room tonight. And so I wonder if perhaps we should start a few steps or even a few decades earlier and go through some of the background leading up to this monetarist experiment, as you put it. So, I mean, just sort of briefly, I think you say in the book that you had studied at the sort of the high chapels of Keynesianism, at economics at Cambridge, a master's degree at Yale. How would you characterize the kind of economic views that you came out into the professional world with from that background?
Well, it was Keynesianism. It was the ideas of John Maynard Keynes as set out essentially in the General Theory, which he published in 1936. Not many of us actually read it, but that was the orthodoxy which we were instructed in. And Keynes's great discovery, I think, was that supply doesn't create its own demand, and it is possible to have unemployment on a continuing basis unless government intervenes. He showed that if planned savings and investment are in disharmony, there can be inflation on the one hand, and there can be unemployment. The classical economists of the 19th century, by contrast, argued that recession was something that just happened. You couldn't do anything about it, and the governments couldn't and shouldn't intervene. Keynes contradicted that and took the view that, yes, government needed to intervene. Remember, he was writing in the Great Depression when unemployment was up to 15 to 20%. And that was that's what we learned at Cambridge and at Yale. And there was a sort of confidence that clever government could manage an economy in such a way as to achieve full employment or near full employment and at the same time avoid inflation. And that's the key. And what happened? After the war, 1950s, inflation started to pick up. Inflation was running on average about 4% in the 1950s. Not horrendous, but it was higher than some people were comfortable with. And the inflation rate crept up. And this was a puzzle. Why was the inflation rate picking up when we had a bit of unemployment as well? And so you had this sort of dilemma. You had, on the one hand, the Keynesians were saying, our professors, you should expand the economy, higher public spending or lower taxes to enable unemployment to be at a minimum level. On the other hand, if inflation was coming up, you needed to deflate the economy. And so there was this sort of dilemma. So what was the answer of the Keynesians? It was that you maintain demand at a limited level, you control demand through tax and spend, and at the same time you persuade the trade unions and price setters in the business community to limit the increases in wages and prices. Mm-hmm. So the view was that you had demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. To deal with demand pull, you limited spending by government or increased taxes. To limit cost push, you persuade the trade unions and employers to behave in a way that wasn't going to create inflation, and that was very much what we were taught. There was a different theory called the quantity theory of money, which had been in vogue in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and slightly ironically promoted by Irving Fisher at Yale University. And this was the theory which has the equation MV equals PT. The stock of money times the velocity of circulation equals national income, P being the price level and T being the volume of goods and services. And this is an identity. It has to be true. And what Irving Fisher and the quantity theorists were saying was, if assuming the velocity of circulation is constant, then changes in the money supply must mean a proportionate change in PT, that is national income. And if you can also assume that output doesn't change, then changes in the money supply flow straight through into prices. We were taught at Cambridge that this was a sort of a historical curiosity. Paul Samuelson, any economists here will know Paul Samuelson's 17 editions of his introductory text to economics. He called it a historical curiosity and a blind alley. But this wasn't the case for Milton Friedman at Chicago. He starting in about 1956, he latched onto the quantity theory and promoted the idea that the way to control inflation was to control the money supply. He famously said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon and nothing else. And he published with a co-researcher, Anna Schwartz, a great volume in 1963, The Monetary History of the United States, where he purportedly showed that there was a close correlation between the money supply or monetary growth in the United States and inflation over the previous 100 years. And based on that correlation, he argued that the way to control inflation was to control the money supply. And by the time I got back to macroeconomics in the Treasury in the mid-1970s, to my surprise, Friedman's theory, which by this time was being called monetarism, had really become half serious and was being taken seriously by the Bank of England and by the Treasury.
And so in the 70s, when you were at the Treasury, the country was confronting some pretty serious economic difficulties. And there seemed that idea that there was a trade-off between between unemployment and inflation seemed to have broken down if it had existed at all. I mean, how bad did things get? You paint the picture quite well in the book, I think.
Well, it was extremely grim. In 1975, inflation peaked at 25%. Well, let's go back a bit. During the Conservative government of Ted Heath, you had a serious miners' strike, which really put paid to the statutory incomes policy that the Heath government enacted, and led to the downfall of the government. There was then a wage free for all in 1974-75, which led to inflation of around 25%. At the same time, there had been a large monetary expansion in 72-73, and Friedman and those of the monetarist thinking blamed the monetary expansion for this inflation. On the other hand, there were those, mainly in the Treasury, but elsewhere, who blamed it on the oil price increase following the Yom Kippur War, an expansionary budget of 1972, and then the wage free for all. So in 1976, when I got back to macroeconomics, things were pretty grim, and the Bank of England were running out of foreign exchange, and the government couldn't borrow abroad, so the government was forced to go to the IMF, and the IMF provided a $4 billion loan in December 1976, which was the largest loan up to that date the IMF had ever provided. It was a serious humiliation for the Labour government, but the package worked pretty well. For the next 2 or 3 years, things went relatively well. But the Labour government's counter-inflation policy was based very much on incomes, on a voluntary incomes accord with the trade unions. And 1978, 79, that broke down disastrously. And then we come to the Thatcher government of 79.
Yeah. And even before that, I think, as you tell it, you have a chapter on Labour's soft monetarism. So these ideas that you described as sort of bubbling up against the Keynesian orthodoxy were already there in diluted form under Labour. But then they came in full force with Margaret Thatcher in 1979.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. The monetarist thinking was bubbling up, and in 1976, partly under pressure from the IMF, who set targets for domestic credit expansion, which is implicitly a monetary target. We published a figure for that. So that was part of the agreement, and we published a projection, well, not a target at that point, for the growth of money supply. Dennis Healey, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, didn't believe in it, but he did it because he published the target because he felt the markets needed it to stabilize the economy.
And it's quite an interesting point, actually, that you describe yourself as a disbelieving monetarist, and you categorize a whole group of civil servants and others as disbelieving monetarists, which is to say you acted on monetarist policies, and you sort of supported them because financial markets supported them, but you didn't think it was an intellectually sound approach.
I didn't, but I wasn't trained at that point in monetary economics. I had studied, as you said, at Cambridge in Keynesian economics. We didn't study monetary economics very much.
But people will say there's not much money in Keynesian economics. Is that?
No, sorry, we didn't look at money. And when I joined Margaret Thatcher in 1979, I joined James Callaghan. I was his private secretary for 7 months before I was with Thatcher. But I knew enough about, or I had learnt enough about it, that I wouldn't say I was dead against monetarism, but I had serious reservations. And the reasons for that were several. First of all, I had learnt from James Tobin at Yale, who was anti-monetarist, the following sort of criticisms. First of all, that you couldn't rely on the stability of the velocity of circulation, which is what the monetarists assumed. Velocity being the ratio between income, national income, and the money stock. And if V was unstable, then you didn't get the carry through. That's the first point. Secondly, the causation wasn't by any means clear. The way monetary expansion takes place is an extremely complex thing. The monetarists assumed that the causation was one way from the money supply to national income, but there was a view that it went the other way in practice, because as national income goes up, then demand for money goes up, and under our system under our monetary system, if there is an expansion of credit, then by the banking system, this actually creates money. So you could argue that and Nicholas Calder was most famous for this at Cambridge, argued that actually it was the causation went from national income to the money supply. In practice, I think it went both ways and does go both ways. And then there was the question of to what extent did a monetary expansion or reduction affect prices or output? The crude monetarist view, which I'm afraid Mrs. Thatcher adhered to, was the money supply went straight through into prices and wouldn't have much effect on output. The more sophisticated view of the monetarists was, yes, there would be a short-term effect on output, and then it would come through in prices. And then the last point was there was a disbelief into how exactly an increase in the money supply would convert itself into an increase in spending and in national income. The problem of what was the transmission from money supply. My tutor at Cambridge, Joan Robinson, called it a mystical, unearthly element in Friedman's thinking. Tim Congdon, who I'm delighted to see here tonight, has written extensively about this, and indeed your latest book goes into it in some detail, and we can talk about that a bit later if you like. But anyway, there were all these criticisms which I was aware of. On the other hand, I was aware, and we were all aware, that there did seem to have been a correlation between monetary expansion and inflation in the early 70s. So there was sort of feeling there might be something in this, but we weren't sure how much. And I don't think any of us thought that you could control inflation entirely by relying on monetary control. There were other things you had to do as well.
So how would you describe the core features of the hard monetarism of maybe the first 2 years of the Thatcher government, which is where a lot of your narrative focuses?
I would say that it meant that we focused in trying to control inflation. We focused almost exclusively on the money supply and on monetary targets, despite the fact that there was some evidence of instability in the equation in V. I say in my book, when I said to Mrs. Thatcher one day that that I was worried that velocity was unstable, and therefore we couldn't rely too much on this relationship in the equation. And she said, "You're being alarmist. You're being defeatist." She wasn't very interested in in some of the more detailed arguments, and I think it's a pity she wasn't exposed to some of the counter arguments. But by the time she came into office, she was very much a convinced monetarist. She really did believe that there was this close connection between monetary expansion and inflation, and that the inflation that we had suffered in the 70s was entirely due to monetary expansion. So that's what we focused on. And we had a monetary target for the first year in office, and then in the second year we produced a medium-term strategy which set out monetary targets for the next 4 years.
I think the last person I spoke to on this stage was Charles Moore, Margaret Thatcher's biographer. And if I'm recalling correctly, during that interview, he described Margaret Thatcher as not really being ideological, as most people normally say, but almost being religious in her convictions, even when they didn't concern religion itself. That's one of the things that seems to come across to me in the story you tell, that she was just 100% fully invested in a particular form of monetarism for those first 2 years, and stuck to it quite doggedly. The second thing that I think is quite extraordinary to a reader today is the idea of a prime minister being so intimately involved in the conduct of monetary policy. And you talk about her organising her own sort of monetary seminars that she would chair herself without economic advisors around her and so on. Probably, certainly not since, but I imagine maybe not before, had a prime minister been so involved in monetary policy, in macroeconomics. I mean, was that strange for you at that point as a civil servant?
No, because at that time, remember, the Treasury controlled interest rates and monetary policy, advised by the Bank of England, and the Bank of England implemented. But it was the Treasury and the Chancellor usually consulting the Prime Minister on all major monetary policy issues. So, and that had been the case under Labour. I suppose there was an uptick under Thatcher because she was so focused on money supply and on monetary policy, and she was absolutely determined to get it right. So I mean, I remember when I was working for Jim Callaghan, Dennis Healy would come in every week. We had weekly meetings, and he would discuss what was to be done, fiscal and monetary policy. No, but I think you're right. I think there was a greater involvement because she was so determined. And on your first point, yeah, she really believed. I mean, it was a sort of conviction. It's clear historically that there is an association between monetary expansion and inflation going back to Roman times. I mean, this isn't something new. The question is whether that association leads one on to believe that in the short term there is this relationship, and that you can and should control inflation through control of the money supply. Bearing in mind also, which I haven't mentioned, is that we didn't really know how to control the money supply. It's not straightforward.
Yeah.
Whatever your definition, there are many definitions. All the M's, the M0, M1, M2, M3. None of them are easy to control. The one that is easiest to control is base money, M0. But very few people actually today or ever believe there is a close connection. M0 is cash with the public, and the bank's reserves with the central bank. Very few people believe you can really relate this narrow base to inflation. That's the one you can control. The others are much more difficult to control. No, but she really believed. She had Nigel Lawson called it he called her a primitivist monetarist. And it just had to be true. It had to be true. And it wasn't something you could discuss with her. You could discuss how to do it. Things like, I had many great discussions with her on many topics, but on the central point, we're going to control the money supply. That was the Holy Grail. And she found it extraordinarily frustrating to find how difficult it was. In May 1979, maybe Tim Congdon could correct me, inflation was running at about 10%, monetary expansion was running at about 12%, and over the next year, monetary expansion took off to close to 20%, as I recall. Inflation took off, it doubled, and it was all going haywire. And now part of this was because of the wage explosion. It wasn't actually because the inflation at that point was not because monetary expansion had been large. In the last year of the Labour government, monetary supply had risen by, I think, 10, 12%, something like that. But inflation a year later was running at 22%. And it says something for her self-confidence that she didn't budge. I mean, she kept going. It was only in 1981, after the famous 1981 budget, that the cabinet turned on her. And they basically said, this can't go on. We've got 3 million unemployed. Inflation is still running at 10%, which is it was when we started. There must be another way, but we can talk about that.
Yeah. Well, you say that there must be another way.
Yeah.
You, I guess, presumably at the time thought there was another way, but presumably it wasn't going back to fiscal fine-tuning and wages and incomes policy.
I hoped that we could go back to an incomes policy, but I realised that it was unrealistic politically. First of all, the trade unions were not minded to deal with the government, and secondly, Mrs. Thatcher had no confidence in incomes policy, and of course, incomes policy hadn't worked under Conservatives. It hadn't worked under Labour, but I felt somehow it ought to be tried once again. But I never said that to her. But I wasn't the only one. And James Mead, the Nobel laureate at Cambridge, who called himself a Keynesian monetarist. I mean, he was from the old Keynesian orthodoxy. But by the 1970s, he had lost faith in the ability to control the real economy, and he'd moved over to the view that we should target money income, money GDP. He didn't believe we should target the money supply because he believed the demand for money was too unstable. But he believed that you could go back to some sort of incomes policy. And indeed, there were two monetarist economists at the LBS, London Business School, Alan Budd, sadly no longer with us, and Terry Dix. There was a Dix, yeah. They wrote a piece saying, with inflation at this sort of level, despite the distortions that incomes policy can lead to, it would be best to have a go once again. But anyway, that was off the table. You couldn't do it. Mrs. Thatcher was determined not to, and the trade unions actually were not minded. So it was unrealistic. No, my view, which I feel I never really articulated, was rather than target a money supply which was unstable and very difficult to control, we should be looking at money income and targeting that, as James Mead had suggested. And we should do that through a careful mixture of monetary and fiscal policy, which in effect is what the Bank of England does today. It doesn't have fiscal policy, but that is actually what the Bank of England does today. It's targeting prices, but also looking at national income. So,
and of course, there's quite a big movement in free market circles actually towards nominal GDP targeting. They call themselves market monetarists.
Oh, do they?
A lot of the time. Yeah, perhaps bigger in America than over here. But yeah.
Hey, can I just make one other point? One other reason why, I explained in my book why I think monetarism was so attractive to Margaret Thatcher. First of all is that the previous orthodoxy wasn't working, incomes policy wasn't working, and monetarism seemed to be a nice alternative. If it worked, you could get inflation down, and you weren't going to cause a lot of unemployment. But the other point is that she saw monetarism coming out of Chicago, and Chicago was the citadel of free market economics, and she sort of assumed that anything from Chicago was right. But actually, and I don't know whether Tim Condon would agree with me, I don't think there's any logical connection between monetarism and free market economics. You could have monetarism under a command economy. That they're not actually, there's an assumption that they are connected, but logically that they're not connected. But she sort of assumed, because Friedman was pro-free markets, fair enough, that as he was promoting this other policy, that somehow that gave it an extra pizzazz.
Do you ever worry, I mean, in this book, that you may be guilty of, I suppose, focusing on one episode in the attempted exercise of monetarism and using it to describe the full field of thought around that issue? Because I suppose, in a sense, what you're focused on here is the first 2 years of the Thatcher government, the attempt to target rates of growth in M3 through a variety of means. And you make a good case that proved to be a lot more difficult than anticipated, and that perhaps signals were misread, or the things they were targeting lost their validity while they were being targeted. I suppose one way to read it is that they did shock therapy by accident when they thought they were pursuing gradualism. Now, and so I understand your criticisms of that. I suppose there's the counter-argument that maybe in the circumstances, shock therapy was needed, and the robust growth in the second half of the 80s is testament to that, even if it was done unintentionally. But do you draw a distinction between those first 2 years of Thatcher's hard monetarism and monetarism writ large?
Yes, I do. I mean, monetarism could work if the relationships were stable and remained as the monetarists expect them to be. But it didn't work out like that. M3 proved a very unstable variable, and it was the Swiss economist who came to investigate in 1981 who said that we by looking at M3, which was running at 24% growth, we were. It was like somebody. He said something like an upside down thermometer. That's right. You're in a bath, a boiling bath, and you're looking at the wrong indicator. So he
and you just keep adding hot water.
You keep adding hot water, exactly.
Right.
I think the legacy, there's some positive legacies from what happened. First of all, money does matter. And the Keynesians basically were ignoring money. Secondly, monetary policy is the way to, if you're fine-tuning, is the way to control inflation, which is what the Bank of England does today. Thirdly, that there's no, you can't buy lower unemployment by inflating the economy. Indeed, you have to be. Friedman invented this concept of the natural rate of unemployment, and that is the rate of unemployment above which inflation decelerates, and below which inflation accelerates, which is quite worrying because it meant if this rate was quite high, which it was in the 1980s, 9%, a 9% natural rate of unemployment meant that to get inflation coming down, unemployment had to be at around 9%. So there was no easy way. I've looked at the numbers, and unemployment went to 11 or 12%. So if the natural rate was 9%, in theory, we could have established a decelerating rate of inflation without going that far. And actually, that's my thesis. If you look at some of the numbers, it's all fairly crude estimation. I estimate that our unemployment went something like 500,000 higher than it needed to be to get inflation starting to come down, which was a pity.
So, and I don't want to put words in your mouth at all here, but I suppose one conclusion you could draw here is that, in a sense, it was right in spirit, but it was wrong in the specific practice.
Yeah, that's what Nigel.
That's how you would say it.
So Nigel Lawson said in his memoir. He wrote the best memoirs about the period. He said, "You're right. I think so. Right in spirit. Got the direction right." And there were some who believed that we needed shock therapy. Patrick Minford believed that the system needed shock therapy. Sam Britton, actually, who was a sort of kind of centrist, very distinguished Financial Times journalist, he believed we need shock therapies. His view was that a government couldn't survive if you had unemployment running at 3 million through the 80s. Actually, we did have unemployment at 3 million for most of the 80s, and the government did survive. But his view was you need to go in hard. And that was what Paul Volcker did in the US. He went in hard with shock therapy. Alan Walters, Mrs. Thatcher's advisor from 1981, took a similar view. The numbers weren't right, but it was all done in the right direction. I think there were others, such as Brian Griffiths, distinguished monetarist economist, who took the view that it was all rather sad and we should have been more gradualist. I don't know what your view of that at that time was, Tim. I think you were a bit of a gradualist too, weren't you? Or were you a shock therapist?
I was a gradualist, but and indeed the point of the medium strategy was that it should be gradual.
No,
it should be.
Well,
gradual.
I'm sure we'll come to it.
It should be gradual. I think I think everybody was shocked and surprised that unemployment went so high, and we lost manufacturing industry dropped by 17% over 5 quarters, something like that. It's a huge. Steel industry, automobile industry, textile industry, I don't want to personalise this, but my family were in textiles in the north. We had a brand new factory exporting high quality fabrics. 17% interest rates and an exchange rate at 240. You just couldn't compete. Like so many businesses, they just collapsed. They couldn't carry on.
Well, one last question from me, and then we'll come to the audience. Although I think I'm about to sneeze. Sorry. No, there you go. That was great timing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I think when I sat down to read the book, I was, in a way, anticipating something different. I thought this will be a very anti-Thatcher book. And we've already discussed, actually, how positive you are about many of the achievements of that period. I think what also comes across, you write about her as a person and as a boss, with a great deal of warmth, I think, which is not necessarily always the impression you get, even from Margaret Thatcher's admirers. Often it's the sort of the toughness that people talk about. But it sounded like you had a great working relationship.
Well, what isn't really well known is she was a really great boss. I mean, with people who, if you knew her well, and you worked like crazy, you could get on extremely well with her. And somewhat ironically, she treated her close civil servants. There were there were 5 private secretaries, and she treated us better than she treated her political colleagues. I was present at some very unhappy meetings with 1 or 2 ministers who I think had better remain nameless.
Although you do recount.
Very rough. I've mentioned David Howell.
Well, I was going to say, Geoffrey Howe, you mentioned him.
Geoffrey Howe, he got used to it. He
sort of working through his red box while she shouted at him.
No, I was thinking of David Howell, who was the Minister for Energy. She was very rough with him, and I thought unfairly. But, she needed to be strong. I mean, she was held back with her radicalism, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I wished now, and I wished at the time, that she'd moved faster on trade union reform, because given the power of the trade unions, it was very difficult to bring inflation down without extra unemployment. Milton Friedman said, "Well, don't worry about the trade unions. If you control the money supply, they will just have to do it. They'll be brought into line." She didn't believe that. She was pragmatic enough to realise that wouldn't be the case. Anyway, I mean, going back to your point, she was extremely. Well, she worked incredibly hard. I mean, her discipline, self-discipline, was extraordinary. And despite difficulties along the way, her self-belief was extraordinary too, which in most respects was helpful. In a way, when it came to monetarism, it wasn't, because we got into this. The self-belief was something which actually drove her to overemphasize, I think, the monetary targets. But Tim Condon may not agree with me on that.
Well, there we go. Tim, thank you very much indeed. Let's, yes, please. On that. Let's take some questions from the audience. Yeah. All right. Well, Sheldon, you had your hand up first.
Fast forward to today. Do you think that there's a consensus between the OBR and the Treasury? And if you were advising the current Conservative government, what advice would you give?
Current Labour government. I would advise. Well, I wouldn't advise them to reinstitute monetary targets. My view is that monetary targets and monetarism are well beyond their sell-by date. I would advise them to take great care. The economy is running at a fairly high level, because unemployment is at 4%, something like that, and there is a real danger that if the economy were to run at a higher level, inflation would start to take off. But as to what the Chancellor should do on, I don't know. I don't have a view on that really. I mean, that's a distributional issue. How much money is taken away from some and how much is given to others. But on the macroeconomics, I think they have to be quite careful. Yep.
Yes, on the side.
Cheers. I'm not an ex-Treasury man, but I am an ex-Bank of England man.
Okay.
And it's fascinating kind of reflection on the trade-offs of what was done to bring high inflation under control back in the 70s and 80s. What's your view on the trade-offs that have occurred over the last decade and a half with QE and the APF in terms of trying to get rid of the zero lower bound and low inflation and low growth?
Yeah. Well, I think in the 2010s, after George Osborne became Chancellor, policy overall was too restrictive. The austerity years, I think we could have, the economy could have grown more rapidly, but the lower, what's it called? The lower. I mean, I don't know why there is this. I know what it means. Interest rates can't go a certain level, but interest rates were very, very low indeed, and this didn't enable the economy to grow as fast as it could have done. And then there's the question of whether fiscal policy should have been brought into play. I think it could have been, but George Osborne was obsessed with the level of debt and debt sustainability. And he wanted to he didn't want the debt level, GDP, to go above 80 or 90%. I personally think that they should have allowed the fiscal deficit to be larger. Over recent times, I personally think the Bank of England have done pretty well. It's arguable whether or not they should have done quite so much of quantitative easing, and there are some, including Tim, who argue that the quantitative easing resulted in the uptick in inflation to around 10% in 2022. There's an alternative view that this was, which I actually take the view on, is that the uptick was due to deterioration in terms of trade, much higher import prices because of the war in Ukraine, and labour shortages as a result of EU workers going, and people becoming inactive in the labour force. But inflation having gone up to 10%, I think they've done a fantastic job. I mean, at the beginning it looked as if policy wasn't quite restrictive enough, but look at the inflation rate now. It's down to 2%. They set out to. If they'd gone in harder, we would have had a recession. We didn't get a recession, so we got inflation. They got inflation down, and we didn't have a recession. Compare that with 1980-81. We got inflation down, but we had a hell of a recession.
Tim.
Thank you, Arch, for your comments. I think I mentioned them 6 or 7 times. The book, it was very fair. Not quite accurate, actually, but...
Well, you better tell the group why you didn't actually meet Thatcher before the election, but I
did. I mentioned, I think, 6 or 7 times the book, and thank you. You're always very fair to me. You're not accurate, because I didn't meet Thatcher before she became Prime Minister, and then you met her in 1982. And when she was Prime Minister, you weren't close at all. The questions I wanted to ask were fiscal policy. Well, the real problem with fiscal policy, and it wasn't become evident in the last 5 years, but it was around in the early 80s, was that if you have excessive deficits, the debt will explode and you'll get a huge debt interest bill. Now, this wasn't the rationale for the tax increases in the 81 budget. that was put over very much because the rationale was much in terms of the medium-term strategy. I will ask you, was there much internal work in the Treasury about the debt interest problem then? And I'm pretty sure there was, because I know some of the people around at the time. I mean, you may go through an answer. But essentially, the debt interest burden had been rising through the late 70s. Interest rates on the government debt were up into the high teens. And frankly, the notion of having an activist stimulatory fiscal policy at any time the last 30, 40 years has been balmy in my view, but only you're getting a very strong statement. I remain active. You can't conduct so-called fiscal reflation in slow-growing mature economies. You just can't do it. We always will get exactly what's happened with trusts and so on, runaway debt interest. You can't do it. And one of the important things about what Thatcher did in the early 80s was actually indeed to bring that aspect of public policy under control. North Sea oil was the other very important point. Okay. The second thing is just a question I want to ask you, because your kind of criticism of monetarism isn't really of monetarism, it's more about this hard monetarism at the time. I would say that, in a way, this is inherited from the IMF. My question to you is, was what the IMF imposed, was that hard monetarism? And you actually kind of said, well, let's just be clear where we're coming from. 1976, we had to ask the IMF to look after our finances were in such a mess. And just so people in the audience probably not aware of this, the average inflation rate for the Labour government from 74 to 79 was 16%. Okay, and then I just finish off on the final question, which is, you very kindly picked this up in your comments, but you say that the natural rate of unemployment, the equilibrium, as Layard and Nicola and so on called it, rose very sharply in probably the late 70s too, but certainly in the early 80s. So you get the cost was extremely unemployed. Well, that's very debatable, it seems to me, and I ask you as a question. Surely the real cost is the difference between the natural rate and the actual rate. And put in those terms, we need really to be thinking about what increased the natural rate in that period. It's things like benefits and other things. I put it in, I've done one review of the book, I'll do another one. And that's really the point I want to focus on, that in my view, you're exaggerating the extent to which monetary policy was the cause of the very large, very, very substantial unemployment that was recorded at the time. There's an awful lot more I want to say. Can I just say finally that thank you for reviving these topics. I don't agree with your verdict on these years, but it's very nice to be able to discuss these things with you.
Okay. Can I also on that?
Yeah, sure.
On some of that. I don't think the recession was entirely due to the monetary and fiscal policy. Probably half of it was due to the world recession and to increasing oil prices of 79. Probably half of the recession was due, however, to monetary and fiscal policy. But some of that was necessary to get the inflation rate down. And what I'm suggesting is that unemployment had to go to about 9%, which is the Nicol-Layard figure. It was the excess over 9% that was unnecessary. Now, these figures are all slightly, I mean, there are assumptions.
It's about 500,000.
I said that. I said earlier. I said between 400, 500. So maybe the policy resulted in an excess of about 500,000, which is quite a large figure. On the question of debt, I don't think Mrs. Thatcher actually thought very much about debt. Debt was not on the agenda with her, actually. What was on the agenda was the money supply. You say she should have been. It should have been. But on the question of whether debt was sustainable, well, I was taught by Keynes and his followers, and probably you were too, that provided the debt was held by residents, it didn't matter too much if the debt interest rate went up, because we were just paying ourselves. Now, it's not as simple as that, because the debt is held on the whole by wealthier people and taxes paid by everybody. And that is where the modern monetary theorists get things wrong. Nonetheless, I believe then that provided there was this internal circulation of interest, that the concerns about debt could be overdone. Actually, 30% of our debt is held overseas, and you have to worry about overseas holders of debt. So I wouldn't take quite as strong a view as you do. And I mean, look at the Japanese. Their debt level is 250% of GDP. Ours is...
It's the debt interest cost which is the critical variance. What is interest? Once that's out of control, it ruins governments. It caused trust to be the shortest prime minister in history.
Well, that was because they couldn't sell the debt. She couldn't sell the debt.
He's out at a decent price.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, and Tim, did you want to just mention the? I think the other part of the question was about whether Thatcher's hard monetarism was sort of rooted in the IMF approach that had been introduced in '76.
I wouldn't say so. No. I mean, her monetarism was rooted in what she had learnt from Friedman and through Keith Joseph and through Tim's primer on monetarism. You see, Dennis Healy didn't really believe in monetarism. He published these figures. What he believed in was prices and incomes policy. He thought we could control the trade unions, and that was the way to do it. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Keynesianism, as it was understood, failed in the 1970s very comprehensively, and we had Mrs. Thatcher, and basically we had a good period for quite a long period of time. Since when we've got, in the academic arena, the economics profession dominated by a new Keynesian philosophy, which clearly has failed. Shouldn't we be targeting your guns more on the Keynesians and the monetarists, or more constructively, should we be trying to construct some new understanding which actually blends better monetarism and Keynesianism to actually bring us out of what has been a terrible 10 years or more, 15 years in the world economy?
Well, I don't think monetary policy can grow the economy. What monetary policy can do is control inflation and make it possible for the economy to running at a reasonably high rate. I mean, to get growth, we need deregulation, we need investment, all the other things. I mean, I don't think the model that the Bank of England are operating, I don't know exactly what you call it. Is it post-Keynesianism? Seems to be working okay. It seems to be doing okay, isn't it? What's your criticism of the bank's policy?
Well, my criticism is for many, many years, the Bank of England said that there was a real danger of inflation being too low. They reduced interest rates, the inflation rate went lower, and then they never moved the interest rates when inflation then went through the roof. There's no evidence that the current tools work properly, but that's probably a reflection of the fact that the understanding of the whole theory of how it works is defective.
Well, they got it wrong in 2021. They should have moved faster to get... I mean, they misforecast. They didn't realise that inflation was going to take off. I think they should have realised it because it was pretty clear with import prices going the way they were. But if you're saying that they should have clamped down to avoid the takeoff entirely, I don't agree with that. If they'd done that, we would have had a major recession, which we didn't need.
Reem, do you want to ask a last question?
Thank you, and thank you for a really, really fascinating discussion. You're obviously quite critical of Thatcher's reliance on the idea that the supply of money in the economy is actually what's the main driver of inflation. I wonder what you thought about her supply side reforms and regulatory reforms, and whether or not that had an impact on inflation throughout her premiership. Thank you.
No, I think on the contrary, the supply side reforms helped to moderate inflation because they produce higher productivity, which was a moderating influence on inflation. So,
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Sir Tim Lankester.
I think